How corrupt is the United Nations really?
On multiple levels, and I don't say this just for the clicks, I say this in truth. The United Nations is corrupt on multiple levels, morally, fiscally. It's really bad. There was over 100 people over a 10-year time span who are UN peacekeepers who were exposed for running a child sex trafficking ring in Haiti. And that was just one, that's over the 10-year span, right? But none of these people went to jail. And they said that what they wanted to do was to advocate for everybody in the room at the time to go back to their own countries and to go to ministers, so pastors, bishops, any kind of clergyman. It could be from the Jewish faith, Islamic faith, and to reinterpret the holy books from the perspective of a feminist lens.
No way. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say.
No, it's okay. It's really bizarre, isn't it?
I was expecting a bit of a rough episode of this podcast, to be fair. But
I'm so sorry.
We need to hear this. Is there a part of you that is concerned, given where you are, what you do, what you speak about? Are you concerned about not necessarily safety, but of course your surroundings for what you do and what you say? Hello friends, and welcome to episode 5 of the State of It podcast with your host, Lewis Brackpool. Today I'm excited to welcome my guest, Mattea Merta. Mattea is a pro-family NGO representative at the United Nations who advocates for the nuclear family, life, and national sovereignty. Mattea also works as a ghostwriter, political advisor, and hosts the Mattea Merta Podcast. In this episode, I wanted to find out how corrupt the United Nations is. Now, we know already on a surface level how corrupt they are, but because she is an insider, I wanted to know just that little bit more. I was unaware of the revelation that peacekeepers were facilitating traffic rings in numerous countries, so we discussed that. Mattea provided some positive news regarding some of the UN's objectives and programs being potentially thwarted, as well as what the future of politics and collaborations with the UN may hold. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did, and a reminder that this episode is available to watch on YouTube and Rumble and to listen to on Spotify. Mattea Merta, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm wonderful. It's an honor to come join you. I've learned so much from you and drawn on your resources, so it's quite an honor for me to be here.
Oh, that means a lot. Genuinely, that really means a lot. I wasn't expecting you to say that. I'm quite taken back by that, actually. I'll be honest with you, because I think we've chatted briefly, and I saw you quite recently on a show on TNT live, and I watched your segment with someone I know, James Freeman, and I was watching it going, I need to talk to her actually, because there is a lot of information that we need to extrapolate. And then when I noticed that you were already following my account on Twitter, I was like, no way, this is awesome. So to hear that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to what you're doing at the minute. We're going to obviously get into it, but yeah, have you been keeping well considering your role and what you do within the United Nations? I can imagine that's intense.
Yes, it is intense. But you know, a lot of people ask me this question, and I find it interesting because I think everybody has a calling on their life, and so I am in my calling. I love doing what I do, and so for me, it's like the intensity and all of the itty gritty grossness of the UN kind of like fuels my fire and makes me want to keep digging deeper. So I'm loving it. My roles vary from time to time, so I like the diversity of it all. So
it's a cursed word, really, isn't it now?
Oh, I know.
We've got a lot to get into. Obviously, your role as a representative in the United Nations is of a pro-family type of role within there. Could you extrapolate on that, and could you give us, the audience, just a sense of an idea of what it is you do, how important it is, and what is it you're trying to achieve?
Of course. So many people think that I actually work for the United Nations, and I want to upfront say absolutely heck no. I work from inside the UN fighting the UN's agendas. And I do that by working with an NGO actually out of Canada. It's called Campaign Life Coalition. And I kind of have a broader purview per se, as opposed to just what the organization advocates for. They're purely a pro-life organization. So I take the pro-life message inside the UN, but then I build upon it. And I say, it's not just about being pro-life, it's about being pro-family. And on top of that, if we want to have strong nations and advocate for national sovereignty, we have to have strong families. So 3 things I cover: life, the family, and national sovereignty. Those things are fundamental to every nation. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. So those are the things I advocate for. And how do I do that? I do that through talking with people and reading so many papers. Growing up, I hated reading, and I was like, this will not be a major part of my life. And now that's basically what I spend most of my time doing on top of being a writer. So it's like, kids, pay attention in school. But I absolutely love getting to expose what the UN's actually doing. And so I'm one of the only people really outside of people who publish, like research papers that the general public can't really understand. I really go in, I find out what's happening, where the UN wants countries to go, and then I kind of tell the public about it.
Wow.
Because this is a major source of every nation's taxpayers' dollars funding, like every single year. So I go in and I talk with civil society, philanthropists, and then the major part, everybody who talks about the UN always talks about, George Soros or Planned Parenthood. And yes, these people have a seat at the table, but it's really governments who are the major funders of the UN in general. So I go in and I try to talk with the delegations to the United Nations. So for example, I originally come from Canada, now in the United States. So I'll go and I'll try to talk with delegates from those countries. So you have to kind of think of the UN as like its own mini government. And then you have all the embassies, and those are called missions to the UN. So every country has a mission to the UN. And so I try my darndest to try to have meetings with these people. It's proving very difficult. And I found out recently why. And it's because the Biden administration, who has been at the forefront of the WHO pandemic treaty, which most people don't talk about, who actually initiates these terrible things. The Biden administration has been at the forefront of this. So they've also come out through the State Department with this thing called the equity program. And they're trying to remove anybody like me, or anybody who has like a baseline of common sense within the UN, under the guise of anti-rights movements. And so nations follow the US because, one, like they're still kind of technically the superpower of the world at this point. Don't know how long that's going to stand, but they follow along with what the US says. And so under this guise of trying to remove anti-rights movements, they're trying to get rid of pro-family, pro-life, pro-national sovereignty voices. And so it's proven very difficult to try and even have these meetings anymore. But thank God he always makes a way. And we've been able to still, we being a pro-family coalition that exists at the UN, we've been able to find ways to still maintain relationships and to build upon those in order to protect nations from adopting really, really bad language from the UN. And, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, just to add to what you were saying about how difficult it must be doing something like that. You're literally in the swamp. I mean, you hear about Trump talking about draining the swamp. I mean, that in and of itself is the swamp as well. So I can't even imagine. I mean, I saw clips as well from your Instagram on your stories where people are shouting, people are going mad. Like I think one of them was to do with feminism. I believe they had a feminist board or something. You roll your eyes.
Yes.
That's great. And it's the way to describe what I'm seeing is like a zoo with the cages open, basically, and everyone's just shouting and everyone's just going nuts. And I thought, is that really what the UN is like? And I didn't have that in my mind originally. I thought it was all people in suits sitting around conference tables like the EU, and it's all very sort of strict. Not literally everyone just shouting, pointing, and just having a go at each other. And I thought, how are you meant to change things from that? I mean, I was blown away by seeing that. So I just wanted to mention that to you.
Yeah, so I believe what you saw, I've been to a couple of commissions, so it's all of them kind of mushed together, but probably what you saw at the largest global feminist conference happens at the UN every year called the Commission on the Status of Women.
Right.
It is the funnest thing to attend because people are so, I was going to say insane. Their ideas are insane and some people act insane. So yes, there is that element to it. That's primarily the civil society acts like that. But then you have, of course, like you said, all the people who show up in suits and they feel really good about themselves because they're trying to save the world and bring peace in a very perverted way. And they're the ones who are the delegates. And so they're the ones who generally will sit there and, just kind of take it for what it is. But yeah, both parties are really fun in their own ways to interact with. But bringing change to that is just being the sound mind of common sense and being willing. Something I've noticed because I worked in the Canadian Parliament, and then I also am now doing this kind of work. And I've noticed something on both ends, the political and the more activism side, or civil society, I guess I would say, where people are really shutting out the voice of common sense and not even willing to have a conversation anymore.
Right.
And so it's become so norm that me being willing to have a conversation with someone of the completely opposite political persuasion, people are very taken off guard by that in a very good way. For example, at the UN about 2-3 years ago, right before the pandemic happened, I was in conversation with a woman from Planned Parenthood, and she had no idea that someone who is pro-life or pro-family would even be willing to have a conversation with her. Come to find out, like, her whole story, she had an abortion and she found so much healing in just having a conversation. And so she's like, I'm going to look at pro-lifers differently. So that's how you change things within the UN system. You actually, sometimes you have to force your foot in the door, quite literally. I have been kicked out of an entire feminist commission at the UN a couple years back. And so you just have to constantly show up, be the voice of reason, and that's how you change things.
I mean, I know that, of course, you believe in Jesus Christ, which is great. Christ is king and all of that. Obviously, I can imagine that's what motivates you the most, because I can't imagine having to turn up to a workplace like that to be the odd one out, be the only person to try and go against all of these people that seem to think that reorganizing the world in their sort of way, knowing that it's destructive, knowing that what they're doing is nefarious, is the only way that I can kind of describe it. Is that what motivates you the most? Is there other motivations that you have to just keep going and keep, going to work, basically? That's, yeah.
It is the primary, it's the pinnacle of it all. And like I said, I worked in the Canadian government, and that's where I really got turned on to the pro-life issue. And hearing the stories of women and families and then communities that have been affected by the issue of abortion, or how central planning or the globalists' agendas are actually going to affect people and are now affecting people. I love people deeply, and so I want the best for people. And so seeing how this perversion is sweeping across nations, and it's all stemming from the UN. That's actually why I got plugged into the UN in the first place, is because I was working in government and I was like, where are all these agendas coming from? Like, it's like policies would just be pumping out. I'm like, where is this craziness coming from? What's the root? Like, I felt like I was dealing with all these symptoms. And then I went to the UN the first time and I was like, this is it. This is the origination of everything.
Right.
And so when I found that, because I had prayed about it, and I was like, God, show me the root. And there it was. So yes, Jesus is the number one reason. He loves people deeply, and so do I. So exposing the darkness and bringing light to it is incredibly important, not just for myself. We're called to be sacrificial and selfless as believers. And so going into these places, I find it quite an honor, regardless of the challenge. So yeah, Jesus is number one, helping people number two.
The main question I wanted to get into with you, because we have a relatively surface level idea, people like me who don't get to go inside of the United Nations. I'm hoping that maybe after we could arrange something where I can go in with you and see it for myself and be able to make a report from it. Maybe we could talk about that afterwards. But I want to know, how corrupt actually is the United Nations? Because like I said, I only have a surface level understanding. There was a report, correct me on this one. There was a report that I saw quite recently. I think it was to do with gender ideology being taught in curriculums, especially across the West. And it was very perverse stuff. I don't even want to really repeat it because it's that, I think you know what I'm talking about. And I
absolutely know.
Yeah. And it's to do with teaching babies and children about
touching themselves.
Yeah. Things like that. Yes. And you then try and think, well, how does someone with that sort of status and sort of power have the mentality to try and put out policy or legislation or even reports about this? How corrupt is the United Nations really?
On multiple levels, and I don't say this just for the clicks, I say this in truth. The United Nations is corrupt on multiple levels, morally, fiscally. It's really bad. It's really, really bad. I've read so many reports, like Associated Press has come out with multiple, and I'm sorry to refer back to them, but I mean, they're the ones doing the reporting on this one, but they reported on so many cases of sexual abuse and misconduct by UN personnel, specifically peacekeepers, right?
Oh no.
Back in 2017, there was over 100 people over a 10-year time span who are UN peacekeepers who were exposed for running a child sex trafficking ring in Haiti. And that was just one, that's over the 10-year span, right? But none of these people went to jail.
Are they still working there?
That's yet to be determined. Out of 100 of them, I'm pretty darn sure at least one or two of them are. Right. But then there was another report that came out over a 12-year span of more sexual abuse, predominantly with children. And the main target area of the UN is Africa. And so there's so many reports, like when I say like over 2,000 peacekeepers have been accused or brought forward for sexual misconduct within just the African region itself. There's another case out of Kosovo of another child sex trafficking ring with regards to UN peacekeepers. So there's so many that have come up. I exposed a couple of years back, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, improper sexual relations happening in Tel Aviv, Israel, with UN peacekeepers. And that went viral. That actually initiated an internal UN investigation. But what's happened? People were put on leave, but, trying to get more facts from people is just like, these people are just still on payroll. Like what is actually being done? Not a lot's being done. So that's one level of corruption. If we're going to talk about the gender ideology issue, my gosh, that document you referred to, it's a very long name. It's the International Technical Guidance on Comprehensive Sexuality Education.
Yeah.
And the UN does these stupid long names for a reason because nobody remembers them.
Yes, true.
But there's two different versions. There's the European version and then there's the North American version.
Okay.
And the European version, 0 to 4-year-olds are taught, they recommend 0 to 4-year-olds are taught how to touch themselves amongst other things. That's not in the Western version, but whatever happens in Europe takes 2 to 5 years to migrate over to United States and North America. And that's what we're seeing in schools. So before this became really prevalent in the American, well, I guess in the global psyche that this was even going to happen in our schools, this perverseness being taught, I was trying to warn people. I was like, I may sound crazy, but I was reading these documents and my coalition at the UN, we're reading these documents and we're trying to sound the alarm bells and people think we're insane. But now it's people's reality. And so I thank God people have woken up to it and have taken credible action against it. But it all rolls back to funding.
Yes.
Our tax dollars are going back to the United Nations to fund these ideologies and these horrible people like the peacekeepers or this gender ideology. And then out of the goodness of people's hearts, it's like we want to help people. And the UN has been painted as a peaceful organization when they're really not.
Can I just quickly ask, just for people who don't know, what is a peacekeeper?
Yes. So a peacekeeper, a lot of people might remember them by seeing pictures in headlines as people wearing blue helmets in war zones. So they'll go in and in destabilized regions of the world, and they'll try to, bring peace and be like that barrier of impartiality. But it never works. Actually, there was a case years and years ago that gained international attention because peacekeepers actually abandoned their posts and left vulnerable people to die. And so it's a really brutal organization, UN Peacekeepers. I try to stay away from it as much as possible. But again, if the vulnerable are being abused, used, or coerced, I'm going to do my best to try and help them.
I'll be honest, I don't know what to say, because all of what you've just told me is actually is news to me, apart from the gender ideology stuff. But what you told about child trafficking rings in multiple countries that the peacekeepers were sort of facilitating. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, they were running it.
I didn't know this. I'm so sorry. I had no idea about this. So I'm actually a bit in shock.
No, most people don't know this stuff. And that's why it needs to get out there, because the one thing that nobody understands about the UN is that you can actually advocate directly with your UN mission. And it's just like, if you're talking with your senator or your member of parliament, you can go and advocate your position. You can do the same thing with the UN mission for your country. And so if you hate what they're doing or what they're advocating for, you can go directly to them. And that's why it's important to expose what they're doing.
Well, you've lit a light bulb up in my mind anyway on what, on ideas anyway. But so when we talk about corruption within the United Nations, it runs very deep. I mean, it's no surprise really, but we're talking very deep.
Look at the head of the UN itself. He was the head of a socialist party in his country. Like, it's all these people, Tedros even, like corrupt politician. So all of these people they're cut from the same cloth. If you look at anybody, in the news who comes out in favor of the United Nations or works there, they're all cut from the same cloth, regardless of what language they use or region they come from in the world. And I also wanted to say this with regards to the corruption issue. The UN is so bloated. In the UK, I love how you describe the bureaucracy, the blob. The UN has its own blob. It's disgusting. But I believe it was high 80% of funds that actually go to the UN don't even make it to the various regions of the world. Over 80%.
Say that again.
Over 80% of the funding that comes into United Nations doesn't even make it to people on the ground. It stays within the UN bureaucracy. That's how bloated the United Nations actually is.
So is it safe to say that the United Nations seems to be just one big conglomerate of, I don't know, people making capital, making money almost for each other, for their mates? Could you describe it as that in a sort of a basic term, or am I being a bit thick here?
You could go down that route.
Right.
You could. However, the United Nations has so many different agencies that it makes sense why it's so bloated, that it makes sense why there's so much funding going just internally and not really reaching out to the people that it's supposed to reach out to. So you could, I think it's safe to say you could go down the line of thinking that you're going with. You just have to add in I'm all about the caveats. So you'd have to add in a couple here and there just to be safe, but I think you could.
Yeah. Well, that brings a new thing to waking up and going to work and trying to be motivated each day. I mean, to be fair, with the corruption, with the awful things that are happening within that organization, that would motivate me every day. So fair play to you for what you're doing. And I'm right in saying that you can't leave the United Nations. I believe I've read that somewhere. Can you leave the United Nations as a country? I'm not 100% sure you can. Is that correct?
You can. Ish.
This is the grey area, isn't it? That I saw. Yeah.
I would advocate more so in the United States when Trump was in, and if and when Trump gets back in, he did the right thing. He kept their voices at the table. But in order to have your voice at the table, again, you have to fund the UN. But here's the loophole for anybody listening. There are voluntary and involuntary branches of the UN that you either have to fund or you can choose to fund. So Donald Trump made the right decision in pulling out from funding specific organizations like United Nations Population Control Commission, UNFPA, or because it went against the organization itself went against United States aimed mission under the Trump administration. And I would dare to say even under the Biden administration, but potato.
Yeah.
But then you have the WHO, also very controversial organization. He pulled out funding from there too. So nations, I would say, should maintain their status at the UN, but because the process to get in is ridiculous. But nonetheless, they should withdraw funding as much as possible.
So am I right in saying you can't technically leave the United Nations, even if there was you just have to pull funding out from certain areas of the United Nations?
If a nation really wanted to, a nation could leave.
Okay.
But that would be not in their best interest necessarily.
No, because I can imagine, similar to the UK leaving the European Union, whilst we could do it, and we did do it, they made things a lot more difficult. It was almost like a punishment for leaving. And a lot of people can't seem to wrap their head around that, because people say, well, this is Brexit. This is the reason for Brexit. No, this is actually, you haven't looked at it from another angle. The EU is punishing the UK for leaving. So they're making it more difficult. Another casing example is if you have people that you've elected that are Europhiles and that love the European Union and want to keep one foot in and one foot out, that's not what people voted for. And I can imagine if there was a campaign to leave the United Nations, it would be that similar case of 1 foot, 1 out. So it wouldn't work. I can only just see punishment and United Nation files wanting to keep one in and one out. I don't know. What do you think?
I've often thought about the similarity between Brexit and nations leaving the UN. I don't think that it would be as bad as the UK has experienced, but I think it would also, there would be a different set of challenges for people. The issue really is that nations within the UN actually take their policy cues from the UN. So this is where I would be slightly more in favor of you just leave, or you completely ignore, or you don't sign on to treaties or whatever have you. It's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one because some of the more vulnerable nations, African nations in particular, they really do rely upon the United Nations. It's become the structure they rely upon. And Western nations in particular, European nations, they are the ones predominantly funding the UN. So then do you up and leave these vulnerable nations to the whims of the UN?
Got you.
It's a tough one. It's a really tough one. But I wrestle with this one a lot.
I can imagine.
That's where I think voluntary funding needs to be stripped as much as possible.
Yeah, I advocate for that. So then going by earlier, what we were talking about, the things that I have seen, could you run through a few things that you have seen in the United Nations when you go to conferences, when you talk on these feminist conferences and the other strange far left agenda-ridden conferences? Could you explain some of the stuff that you have seen personally?
Yeah, absolutely. The one story that always sticks out in my mind was when I actually wandered into a meeting the first time I was ever at the Commission on the Status of Women. And I wandered into this meeting. I didn't register for it. I was just like walking around and I was like, you know what? This sounds interesting. Walk in and it's this group of politicians from, I believe it was Norway, a couple of politicians from that region in the world, and civil society. And they were talking about faith matters. And I was like, great. When I say I was so naive, I thought this was going to be like, I could plug in. I'm a Christian. I'm going to be a part of this thing. Yes. but they're talking about faith from a very deceptive place. And they said that what they wanted to do was to advocate for everybody in the room at the time to go back to their own countries and to go to ministers, so pastors, bishops, any kind of clergyman. It could be from the Jewish faith, Islamic faith, and to reinterpret the holy books from the perspective of a feminist lens.
No way.
And then if the bishop or a Jewish leader, whoever did not follow through with the interpretation and preaching from the pulpit, that interpretation that you demand from them, then you need to expose them, write articles about them, go on radio and blast them.
What?
So this was one of this was one of the many things that I've heard. And I was just sitting there and I was like, I must have heard that wrong. There's no way. And then they repeated it. And I was like, this is very real. People are actually doing this. And then you start seeing all of the, like UK is a brilliant example where you have all these bishops who have rainbow flags over the pulpits and they're even wearing them. It's bizarre to me, but I can't help but think, really, is this a byproduct of individuals attending the UN and being plugged into these groups that are able to have a voice there? And then these politicians who advocate for diversity and equity. And so that was one of the major things that I heard that was just so bizarre. Another one is when I was actually in what was it? I think it was Hungary and Poland were hosting alongside Brazil under the Bolsonaro government at the time, a meeting. And we were just sitting there and talking about poverty reduction and the need for uplifting the family and how that's a major support in societies. And if we promote the family, it's going to drive down poverty. And then all of a sudden we see these crazy people jump up and of course they have the blue hair, pink hair, they're all in crazy clothes and they're just like, no, this is evil, what you're talking about. And I just look at them and they're like, make sure that children know that they can be gay. And it's like, what does that have to do anything with what we're talking about?
Right.
But we were advocating, of course, for the family. And so everything, I've listened a lot to individuals like James O'Keefe, who has had this recent revelation that, oh my gosh, like everything is spiritual, like everything becomes spiritual. Yep. And going into the UN, it really is that. You just see this people manifesting almost, and it's very bizarre to one, hear about such stories from other people, but then to witness it yourself. It's just like, we're talking about poverty reduction and uplifting the family. And you're like, let children be gay. It's like, what is this? What is this? So some things are just so nonsensical.
Forgive me for laughing.
I'll finish it with this, but it's just like UN personnel. There's of course the bureaucrats of the UN, but then there are UN special rapporteurs.
Right.
They're the most prominent people in their field who come and they willingly accept this nomination to be a special rapporteur in whatever field. And so there's this one individual, in particular, who is the sexual health rapporteur for the United Nations. And she openly advocates, she's a former abortionist, so you already know what she believes, but she openly advocates in favor of the decriminalization of prostitution. And children should be able to have the opportunity to have access to pornography and abortion and gender ideology. Like it's so bizarre. And she's allowed to have the seat at the table and represent the UN. And so it's really like, there's just so many concerning things that I see there. But these are just a couple of the recent ones.
I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. No,
it's okay. It's really bizarre. Isn't it?
I was expecting a bit of a rough episode of this podcast, to be fair. But
I'm so sorry.
We need to hear this because I like what you mentioned about the Peacekeepers scandal and the rings, along with what you're talking about now. I mean, it's unsurprising, but it's unsurprising, but it isn't at the same time. It's like when you almost in your mind, you go, how could people act like this? But then when you hear it, you go, people are acting like this, but I'm unsurprised, but it's bizarre. So I can't really fit that in my head. Can you, so how did you join the United Nations? How did you manage to get there? Can anyone become a member? Like, how does it work?
So for me, I was actually working again, Canadian Parliament with an MP, and I became very passionate about the pro-life issue. Mm-hmm. And so I was at the time both still running English is difficult sometimes.
That's all right.
I was running social media for him, and then I was also dealing with a lot of lobbyists and going back and forth to the constituency. And again, I just had this search for truth with regards to the roots of the issues I was seeing policy-wise. And I was talking with one of the lobbyist groups, and Campaign Life Coalition is the group. And they started talking about the UN. And I was like, man, there's just something there. Like, it's just in my heart, I knew there's something there, and I had this tug towards it. And so I actually took a vacation. I never really took vacations. My boss forced me to at times. Thank God he did. And he said, yeah, do whatever you want. And so I actually took about a week and a half, 2 weeks, and went to the UN. And I just went with a group. And then I was like, this is it. So I ended up getting out of government and fighting the UN. So anybody can join technically if you're a part of civil society.
Okay.
So if you find a group, whatever group it may be, there's groups that deal with tech, there's groups that deal with the environment that all go to the UN and have a specific status. So my status is that I can go in at any point in time in the year and take part of commissions and, just go and talk with people, really. And so that's a perk of being a tie into civil society. The only other really way to get in is if you're a bureaucrat with your government and you get stationed there. Every 3 to 4, sometimes 5 years, there's a turnaround of every delegation at the UN. And so those are really the two avenues to get in.
It's kind of just this is just blowing my mind, and I don't really know what to say. But I'm very impressed. I'm very, very impressed. The fact that you had that calling, you had that moment where you thought, let me just look at this, let me just analyze this, and then you realized that it was your calling to go. That's fantastic. I'm very grateful that someone like you with your voice is in there trying to fight against it, because it must seem like an impossible battle, but anything can happen. What do you think the future of politics and collaboration with the United Nations and its almost impact for the future? What do you think is the future? Does the future look bleak? Does there look like a glimmer of hope? I mean, what do you think, based on your experience and what you're heading towards?
Honestly, I'm an eternal optimist, but removing that from the equation, I think that we actually are seeing some really good things at the UN right now.
Great.
And I can say that in truth, because I'll take the pandemic treaty as an example. The head, Tedros himself, and Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN itself, are both very concerned that it's not going to go through in May.
Good.
And why is that? Because so many nations have woken up, and I think COVID was actually a blessing for this.
Sure.
I think so many nations have woken up to the deception of the UN itself and of the WHO itself. And so nations are like, no, we're not going to sign on to this, or they're giving reservations, which means we're not going to abide. If we sign on, we're not going to abide by this part of it or this part of it. And the heads of the UN and WHO are like, well, if we don't have uniformity in agreement, we can't move forward with this agenda. So what are we going to do? Like, they're freaking out. And anytime bad guys freak out makes my heart so happy. So it's a good thing on that part. One really cool thing with the pro-family coalition I'm in there, we've been able to hold back a lot of the perverseness that the UN has wanted to move forward with for decades. I joined about 5-6 years ago, and I've just seen how there's just this, nothing is new under the sun. So none of the tactics that the UN or bureaucrats at the UN or nations who advocate for whatever things they want to advocate for, nothing's new. And so it's continually the same fight. And people are realizing, like, they're just getting upset. I'll give this example. we go to this feminist commission, right? Or the commission about a week after, which is the Population Control Commission. And we go to these commissions and nothing is being produced from them. So all this civil society comes to them and they're like, oh yeah, we're here to get our selfies and whatever. But at the same time as that, there's documents being worked on to steer and give direction to both governments as well as the UN itself as to what they're going to try and accomplish in the next year. And that means funding. Everything comes back to money. So documents have not been able to be produced out of these commissions for a couple of years now. And, the trickling of, slight documentation has been able to be produced, but nothing substantial. And so governments are like, well, what's the point in even having these commissions anymore? And it's like, yes, that's brilliant. Less money goes to the UN that way. And then the status that and clout that we give these UN branches like UN Women, UNFPA, UNICEF, WHO, it kind of falls apart. Because people aren't going to the UN and getting their selfies and, that cross-pollination online that people end up seeing doesn't occur. And so the more that we can really drive down participation in the UN, the better. And that's what I'm seeing. Governments are kind of just sick of it. I just actually read an article of how at this last feminist commission in March, there wasn't enough security staff and nobody wants to work for them. Or there's just not enough funding to bring security on board. So they had to shut down meetings really quickly or deliberations were just cut off. And so it's just like, okay, cool. That's a good sign. So there are good things happening. They're going to try and push harder. I will say that. They're trying to push harder in the censorship online sphere. So that's something to really look for. Because governments like the United States are all on board for that. So there are concerning things. Pandemic treaty is still a thing. Yeah. It might move forward, it might not. And so we just gotta keep fighting against it. But yeah, the UN is kind of falling apart at this point, and it makes me really happy.
Makes me very happy as an outsider. Could you extrapolate a bit? You mentioned just a second ago about censorship. That's a massive thing. I watch a lot of Schellenberger, who talks about the censorship industrial complex and things like that. And obviously the United Nations has a part in that. And you mentioned about concerns about the pandemic treaty, which I've covered extensively beforehand, but I'm more curious about the censorship industrial complex and what's surrounding that. Would you mind extrapolating about what's happening and what you say you're worried about it? Could you explain?
Yeah, so recently the UN has come out with a global digital compact, at least the zero draft of it. And so I was kind of skimming through it. I haven't every document is so long, but I've made my way through some of it. And it's very concerning because, of course, they're advocating for example, AI to be diverse and inclusive and equity to be applied, and for specific voices like ours to be really censored out. Okay. And so when it comes to AI, it's going to be a major tool of the future. It kind of terrifies me, but at the same time, I think it could be a tool used for good too. But all of these algorithms, there was actually a meeting, now that it comes to mind, a couple months ago, where never before at the UN has Google, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, all these groups showed up at the UN for a meeting and all showed up in agreement. That was the main component that was kind of a ringing red bell for me, that everybody showed up in agreement that they would move forward in trying to achieve not just Agenda 2030, which is extremely concerning, but also with potentially with something like the Global Digital Compact, which is en masse censorship. Doesn't matter where you are or who you are. At some point in time, you will trigger that system if the compact comes into play, and you most likely will have your voice completely cut out of the online sphere, which is now we know the new public sphere, right? Sure. Or public square. So that is something that's very concerning. And I really do believe that if we have some governments like African nations, for example, it's kind of the African voting bloc, everybody at the UN kind of downplays their importance, but they're really the main ones holding back a lot of these agendas, whether it's gender ideology or in the tech sphere, censorship, I guess you could say. They're really the ones that are holding back, but they need encouragement. So if you can go and send an email to I don't know, Nigeria or Ghana, many different nations that are very conservative over there, they're willing to take a stand. They just need encouragement. But yeah, there's a couple other menial things happening with regards to censorship at the UN. Interestingly enough, last year at the Feminist Commission, there's always a theme and then a sub-theme. But the main theme was basically getting everybody on board for the whole world to be plugged in online. So where does that lead us in the future, right? If everybody's online, the government can censor anybody they want. Everybody needs a digital ID. That's something else that the Global Digital Compact wants, is everybody to have a digital ID.
Yep.
Very creepy, very eerie. And if everybody's online, they're able to monitor everybody's, whether it's transactions, whether that's what you browse. If you're looking at your content and I'm in Canada and this digital compact comes into play, oopsie, like I'm going to get a ding on my digital ID. So think of China, think of the CCP and what those individuals, what people there have to deal with. That's essentially what they want to roll out worldwide. So it's a little bit creepy, but people are still willing to take a stand for it. European voting bloc also, they've surprised me. They're not so totally sold out for it. So
that's encouraging. That's so encouraging. There's another one as well that I've covered, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The magic date, it's either 2030 or 2050. They kind of haven't made their mind up exactly yet. We're seeing a lot of that being pushed upon people, whether that be net zero is a huge topic that is sweeping, especially the EU, and of course, America and Canada and places like that. Do you see that from what you know, do you see that still is on course, or is there a way, do you think that could be derailed? I mean, I know if you look into things like net zero, you can pick out faults. It's like a house of cards. You could just pull one card out and it comes crumbling down easily. But people don't have the opportunity to debate or to get on a platform and talk about these sorts of things to high delegates, whether it be in the United Nations or in government in general. Do you see pushback within the United Nations? Do you see that house of cards sort of wobbling? What's your take?
Yeah, so individual sustainable development goals themselves have been hindered a lot.
Good.
And, whether it's the gender equality or nutrition, I did an interview years ago and me and this host went through every single sustainable development goal. And the end goal of them is not just socialism, but communism on a global scale, right? So people are waking up to this and governments themselves are waking up to this. So people are willing to adopt what they want, and other nations are just like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Like, goes against our cultural beliefs. And so there is pushback within the UN, but then of course other nations will flip flop depending on which administration comes in, right? Like we had Trump in the United States, and then we had Biden, two polar opposites at the UN.
Sure.
Trump was the one, and his administration was holding back the perverseness of, we keep going with the theme of gender ideology, but he held back that from both his endorsement of it, but then that meant that nations looked to the US and went, okay, no, we feel safe because we're not going to endorse this as well because the United States isn't doing it. And then now we have Biden in, and it's like, okay, they're willing to support it. But I will say this about Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals came because the failure of the Millennium Development Goals, which came before them. And so there's always this talk at the UN, like, we want to accomplish this, but we need to do more. There's more to do. And it's like, yes, there's always more to do because you're absolute failures. Nobody likes you. Nobody likes what you're talking about. Everybody sees now that this is communism cloaked up as peace and tranquility, but it's not. And so, yes, there is a lot of pushback. And just as the Millennium Development Goals failed, I'm seeing Agenda 2030 fail, but it doesn't really appear that way to the general public, I think, because you constantly see this barragement of people almost yelling at us. But I think it's because people have woken up and are speaking now. And the more we talk about these things and how bad Agenda 2030 is, the more that there's going to be pushback, but it just means because we're winning. So everybody needs to keep talking about it.
You know, it's very, very encouraging to hear, despite all these horrible things that are happening in the United Nations, at least there is some kind of pushback, and that's really, really encouraging. I need to get myself over there. I need to have a look for myself. I need to see this, because I think a lot of people hear stories, they hear things, but they don't actually see what's going on. And you have that first-hand knowledge of seeing what happens in the United Nations and how people act within the UN. And the fact that I'm hearing all these stories of people jumping up and shouting and screaming like in a zoo, no gatekeepers, no nothing, just the cage is open and everyone's fighting. That's worrying. It's unsurprising considering the politics and the culture, the Western culture of today, and the infiltration of Marxism through the institutions and the educational system that has sort of, I don't know, been passed down to college students, to university students, and they go on to be delegates, or they go on to serving government. It's quite terrifying, really, if you think about it like that. But that's the fact. That's what's happening. But I need to go. I need to see this. I really need to go and see this now. I need to do some reports there, so I have to sort something out.
Yeah, I think we can.
Awesome. So what's on the future? What's on the cards for the future then? What do you have any conferences coming up? Is there some important work that you're doing at the moment? Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening? What's to be expected from yourself?
Yeah, well, with regards to the UN file, I have quite a few projects on the go. The UN is just one of the many. But dealing with the General Assembly and watching out for, that's later on in the year, but further, I think May is going to be the month to watch for, because it's the coming in of the pandemic treaty, potentially.
May.
So
okay.
Looking at what that might look like for the future, I'm going to keep an eye out on that one. And I'm going to try and publish more articles. I do a lot of writing, but not a lot of writing for myself. So I'm going to try and get back to writing for myself, because I think people need to be able to understand what's happening at the UN, but not have to read all the documents that I read at the UN. And so I think there's going to be a lot more publication. Maybe I have a podcast. Maybe I'll do a couple more in-depth studies with people to help them understand how the UN actually impacts them on an individual basis. So that's what it's looking like for me in the future.
Good stuff. And I think in the beginning of the video that I've recorded separately, I've put in for where people can find your podcast and where people can find your work as well.
Thank you.
One of the questions as well I wanted to ask, I know you're obviously not frightened, because, you know, when you have faith, you channel that to your faith and it gives you strength, it gives you wisdom and guidance. So that's not the correct term, frightened. But is there a part of you that is concerned, given where you are, what you do, what you speak about? Are you concerned about not necessarily safety, but of course your surroundings for what you do and what you say?
A lot of people ask me this question, and more so recently, and I'm like, should I be more concerned than I am? No,
I don't mean to frighten you.
No. It's. I've thought about this quite a bit. I have had death threats in the past.
Okay.
And I mean, that just comes with the territory.
Sure.
I mean, whatever. And I was kind of shaken up at the time. But, you know, growing up, I played so many sports. And my coach always said, if I'm yelling at you, it's because I see something in you. And so if I have people yelling at me and sending death threats, it means I'm doing something right.
Got you.
And so now I've always been very cautious of my surroundings. I mean, for anybody watching who wants to come at me, I know Krav Maga, so go at it. But no, I know what God's promised to me, and I'm so secure in that and peaceful with that He'll protect me anywhere I go. And at the same time, he said he calls us, each and every believer, to go and take territory.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm doing. And I know if he's called me to do it, that he's going to sustain me through it. So I'm not really too concerned at all. I will say that when I exposed the UN a couple of years ago with the thing in Tel Aviv, Israel, when your name blows up and goes viral, like Israel is reporting on it and Beirut, and then you have Brazil and all these different nations, it's like, oh, like what you actually publish matters. And so that was a little nerve wracking. I did look over my shoulder every once in a while, but I don't know. I'm just a cautious being.
Yeah.
But I know that I'm good.
Good. Oh, God bless you. Mattea, thank you so much for taking your time out to have a chat. I'll be honest, I'm quite shocked for quite a lot of the stuff that I've heard. Some of it I didn't know, some of it obviously I did, but the stuff that I didn't know, I'm genuinely shocked about it. And I'm sure the audience, whether they know it or not, will still be shocked to even hear it. But genuinely, thank you so much for what you're doing. We'll have to have a catch up as well, and we'll have to have a talk about potentially collaborating or something and doing something over there. That would be really fun. Thank you once again. I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for what you're doing. Seriously, I refer back, and when I say refer back to your stuff all the time, it's so brilliant. You have this brain where you can connect the dots and see things through society and just weave everything together. So incredibly, incredibly helpful. Thanks for what you're doing. That
means a lot. Thank you so much. And we'll catch up again very, very soon. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.